welcome to episode 61. This is quite amazing. We've done 61. This is episode 61. This is our host reflection. And over the past few weeks, we've had some quite exciting discussions about UDL, about data from Finland, also about higher education. We were just chatting about higher education. Where would higher education go? It's a lot of different innovative things happening at the universities. But it was really wonderful to hear from UNESCO about where higher education was. It was also quite interesting to look at how universal design for learning has, in many ways, touches upon the idea about design for learning of everyone, and which goes also our discussion about personalization of learning, which I think Punya will talk a little bit about later on our next 3 episodes, which talks a lot about personalized learning. So, but today, this is the host reflection. And Kurt just finished running around Indiana, and it's great to see him. And he was, I don't know what he was doing, but he said he was going to be late. Now you're back. Okay. So
with beer.
Let's start with actually Punya. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you've been thinking about over the last a few weeks?
Kurt, I don't think we can go into product placement on the show. As tempting as it is.
I got one for you too.
I don't think we can do product placement.
Oh, I'm willing to sell out for some beer. As long as I get it free,
Blood orange, just for you, Punya.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Stop at that. I don't stop. I got pizza too.
All right, Punya, go for it. Let's ignore Kurt for now.
So I want to. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the next 3 episodes coming up around creativity towards the end. But I think the thing that we were talking about just before we started around higher education, I think I'm sorry to have missed last week's episode, but I think there is going to be some significant changes that were already happening, which I think might get accelerated due to the pandemic, because I can just see from our programs, a lot of international students are sort of hesitant about coming back, or were stuck in their home countries because of COVID. Universities had to respond to them in some ways. And I wonder if that's a worthwhile topic for us to sort of dig around a little bit about changes that we see in higher ed. I mean, one of the things that we were talking about just before we started was this sort of rise of the global university. And that's been the idea's been around for a while, but we're seeing moves at, ASU, where I'm at University of Arizona, at Purdue, to partner with other companies, to partner with other institutions, maybe in the home countries, to see, what does that mean and what implications does that have? And I think one of the sort of challenges there is going to be the issue of cost. One of the challenges is going to be, there is also this sort of criticism that this emphasis too much on STEM and the humanities. I think there are lots of issues here that we can unpack. I don't know if that's a topic that would be good for us to dig into a little bit today.
Chris, what do you think?
Well, I'm fine with that topic. I want to talk about some discouraging headlines that I've seen in the last week or two about chancellors of major urban cities saying no virtual learning. It's banned. Everybody has to be face-to-face. A lot of universities, at least undergrad, same story. No virtual learning, got to be face-to-face. And I'm reminded that a little over a year ago, there was a major urban superintendent who said, we're not going to teach any kid anything because we don't think that virtual learning works. And all that we're going to do is increase the achievement gap. And I remember there was the head of a major teachers union who said, we haven't been prepared to teach virtually, so we're just not going to teach the kids anything. So there's this really interesting phenomenon, I think, of blaming the medium instead of accepting responsibility for doing a poor job. because there's lots of evidence that virtual learning can work very well and can work very well for all students, not just for a few students, if it's done well. But of course, if you haven't done it well, then instead of accepting responsibility, it's much easier to say, this is an evil medium, nobody can succeed with it. And so we're going to ban it to make sure that we'll go back to face-to-face. And then, of course, we'll ignore the fact that a lot of kids aren't doing well face-to-face. The reason they're not doing well must be because they had to learn virtually for a while, and it short-circuited their brains. It's just really discouraging. And it illustrates why education is so often 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, rather than actually evolving as a sector. Because it's people using it for political purposes rather than feeling their primary allegiance is to the students. I'm just laying it out the way that I see it. And it's sad. It's sad that we haven't learned more from this, that the media is just buying into it, the parents are just buying into it, instead of people rising up and saying what I'm saying.
So if I can just
So I'm mad
that.
as hell and I don't want to
Okay.
take it anymore. That's my
Right.
contribution to today.
Okay, if I can just add to that, I think that you're also though seeing a little bit of pushback from some parents who see that it has worked for their kids. And so it's, so the pushback is not necessarily, I think the media stories are one way, but I think there are other stories that need to be told, which are not necessarily. So this is sort of, I'm agreeing with you, Chris, that it's become a one-sided kind of a thing. Well, I think it's much more complicated than that.
I just wrote an article for educational leadership at ASCD, make a strong argument for schools not to abandon remote learning. Even if when they return, you can't abandon that. You cannot treat that as an emergency deal. Oh, we're done now. We can go, we can go back to full learning. But that's also dangerous. I just want to add another thing. With Pune was talking, higher education definitely needs to be talked about. Remote learning of higher education, global distribution of students. Chris talking about really not blaming the medium, not blaming the technology, and I just want to add one more thing. Governments, states, and the countries are returning standardized testing, as accountability, as to measure students' so-called learning loss. I think that's really the wrong message. I think a lot of education leaders have to bear the responsibility to say, let's not try to rush back to testing. And as you may know, the federal government is launching a lot of grant applications for schools, try to say how well you improve reading and math. A lot of schools are really constrained by that as well. So that's another issue. I think we have not had a guest to talk about this. Maybe we can invite the Secretary of Education. Maybe he will be interested in this show to say, why the hell are you doing this? That's another thing I think want to think about. This section should have emailed to him. He might want to come to explain why he's doing that. Kurt, I was wondering if after running around a mountain for twice, and after getting your beer and your pizza, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I do. Of course. I've been saving articles for 2 weeks for this show, maybe 3. And I definitely agree with Chris. I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore. I think we should just start with that old movie with the guys yelling out the window. We will have an episode like that, But there's many people who have showed up in the press in the past few weeks that we can invite in. And, I'm going to take a stab at inviting the new EduCause Horizons for 2021 article after this show. I'll bring them in a month or so or 2. But the politicians are crazy. I actually like the guy from New Jersey, the governor, Phil Murphy, and then he says, we'll no longer send the students online. We're not going to have it. Like, where's he coming from? You just think this is an either-or decision? We flip on a switch, we don't flip on a switch. It's just the same with the term emergency remote teaching. It just gives second-class status to anything that's not the way that they were taught, and it's not just New Jersey. It's also Connecticut won't require districts to offer virtual learning next fall.
It's Massachusetts. Massachusetts governor said the same thing. No, none of this virtual learning in my state.
It just, none of this crap. We don't want it anymore. We've had enough. Gavin Newsom, California, want to eliminate or at least partially cut remote options. But school districts, some parents, particularly Black parents, are pushing back. And that, to me, is the news of the week. If we start reading these articles, why some Black teens thrived in remote school, and they go through issues of, their chance to be anonymous. They're not being bullied in schools. It's not just them. It's special education as well, students in special ed types of classes. But the articles about many parents fret over remote learning. Some find their kids are thriving. It's both. It's going to be both. And every delivery mechanism is going to have both. It's not an either or switch. And the sooner this show can help people wake up to the fact that everything has flaws and limitations, that everything has benefits and has success stories wrapped around them. Millions of success stories in the area of online teaching and learning during the past year and a half. We can uncover them if we wanted to. And so, I'm gathering them, but it's Indiana too. The State Board, Indiana approves a couple of virtual. We've had problems in virtual schools here in Indiana, people ripping them off, milking it for dollars and so forth. It's been in the press here. So, our schools, MCFC is going to offer we are going to offer online option to kids here in Bloomington, Indiana. But it's not just that. In the Chronicle of Higher Ed, students give passing grades to pandemic learning. And coinciding with that article, the next day, there's a silver lining for learning in the Chronicle. You see the article? A pandemic silver lining. Many people are talking about their teaching. The fact that people are finally talking about what they're doing in their classes. The pandemic is getting people to say, "Oh, I tried this. This didn't work so well." That's, to me, it's a great benefit of what's going on here. So, that's a couple of shows possibly. But the other one that the paper was in USA Today on Tuesday. Tech giants offered training programs, whether it's Amazon's upskilling program, IBM's Skills Build, Google's career certificates, and Cisco and Microsoft. Maybe we need to bring someone in from the corporate setting, in the corporate world, to talk about one or two of these. I've got contacts. I haven't thought closely about who we could possibly bring in, but if someone wants to work on such a show with me, let me know, and maybe we can bring and have a corporate focus for one. So there's a couple of things we could talk about. The fact that the Chronicle of Higher Ed, it has a silver lining. I think that's just, there we go.
So out of this, we really have two big issues, I think. One is we can keep arguing for keeping this remote learning. And another issue is that how higher education can set an example with this. So, higher education apparently is not returning to campus to say, they would not be to say, well, we're only going to do in person. I think, the issue with the K-12 schools, I think the governors and other politicians, they have to say that to maybe just for the parents who have to stay home because of children. You look at the statistic, employment data came out of yesterday. You see a lot of parents say, well, I have to stay home, take care of my kids. So maybe when the governors, when they talk about talking about K-12 schools, not remote learning, but I think they don't really quite understand what remote learning is. But, let's talk about higher education first. Really, I'm really quite interested in this. Last week we had two guests and talk about digitization strategies, all those things. I'm actually curious at your view, you guys. What do you think about the global competition for higher education if everybody moved online, except Harvard? Chris, Harvard may not be online, but others, imagine ASU, Arizona State University, trying to sell like 1 million degrees a year. What would that be like, Punya? So just think about that. How would that affect third world or developing countries' universities?
So I think there's an interesting issue here of brand that's going to become quite critical in the global sense, right? So if you are in India and you think about US universities, you are not necessarily thinking of University of Kansas. You're not necessarily thinking of Indiana or Michigan or Arizona State. You are thinking of Harvard, Cornell. I mean, those are those names that just people know off the top of their heads. And so I think that so it's going to be this interesting situation of how do you make the sort of the marketing of it is going to become super interesting, because there are also lots of little bit players who say we are an American university. And and it's not just America though, right? I mean, it is the numbers of students wanting to go to Australia, the number of students wanting to go to Canada, wanting to go to Europe. So it's truly a global marketplace in that sense. And unless you are sort of these 10 names which everybody knows, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, you can list those, right? Those are the ones which have sort of global brand recognition. It's like Nike or Coca-Cola. Everybody else is honestly sort of starting from a similar space. So it's going to be interesting to see who will have sort of first mover advantage in that space. So that's one thing that I've sort of wondered about.
But it is true, the Punya, that some countries with a value, let's say a degree from the US more than their local. So wherever.
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. But the thing that happens there though is that if you're not the top 10, 15 brands, right, everybody else is equal. So ASU has any bigger thing than some guy who is running some little, not guy, but some organization, as long as you can claim to be in the US. Right. It is a US degree, right? So that way the landscape is flat. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
So yes, I agree. The cachet of a degree from the US, but it is linked necessarily to particular universities and so on, apart from a few. That's the thinking.
Well, this is all speculation. So I don't know if many universities are really up to think like that globally. But I would love to see how Chris or Kurt and react to that question about this possible global competition because of remote learning. I think last week we touched upon a little bit about that. And so where would that be,
Well, I think that this is another example, as with high stakes tests, of using the wrong measure to determine what quality is. That somehow quality is getting, no matter where you are in the world, quality is getting an elite university degree from the United States. No matter who you are, no matter what your purpose in life is, there's just one solution. It's like saying, look, if you have an irregular heartbeat, you should go to the Mayo Clinic. I mean, nowhere else can really handle that situation. And of course, the elite universities don't contradict this, although they should. It seems to me that the right measures for quality would be, can I declare a passion instead of declaring a major and get a really good interdisciplinary education that's based around my passion and how I learn? That's something that we've heard about in past programs and can hear about it again in future programs. Do I have some kind of a lifelong learning opportunity here, as opposed to putting in 4 years, running up $300,000 in debt, and then trying to stagger on, for the rest of my life, paying off the debt and not having a penny to use for further learning? Is there an opportunity for continuous lifelong learning, as opposed to saying it's 13 to 16 and you're out, and then you're set because you've got an elite university degree? So there'd be a whole set of measures that we could list. Can I get micro-credentials during my courses, as opposed to an all or nothing degree at the end of 4 years? Will my assessments be performance-based as opposed to based on seat time? So I just think it's a shame that the universities that are elite and therefore understand that the things that we're talking about are true, instead of saying, wait a minute, you know, Harvard is a certain kind of tool that certain kind of people need. It's not a universal, you know, magic learning potion that you drink it and then you're more successful than anybody who hasn't drunk that magic learning potion. And let's talk about an ecosystem of higher education institutions where the niche for you may not be elite, not because you're not special, but because elite is the wrong way to think about this stuff. But we're not going to see that for the same reason that we don't see it in K-12. It's sad.
Well, you know,
So-
the question.
Zhao, can I
Go ahead.
follow up something that Chris is saying? So I think, Chris, you made a really good point there that as our lifespans increase, as our career options over time, which is something we're going to see, which we're already seeing, which I think is going to only increase. So for instance, I can speak specifically to sort of Arizona State. One of the things that we have been involved in, and I say we, I mean, not that I have been part of it, but it's as an institution. So firstly, President Crow talks about the university as an enterprise, sort of a different way of talking about it than most other institutions do, which I think some people find troublesome in some ways. And now we are looking at three different enterprises within that. So the one is the academic enterprise, which is sort of the provost and, you know, academic and degree programs, 4-year, PhD, so on. You have the second enterprise, which is the knowledge enterprise, which is sort of the creation of knowledge. That's the research. That's satellites and, you know, microbiology and, you know, whatever it may be. The third that is being known as the learning enterprise. And the idea there is exactly saying, which is these kinds of micro credentials, and that the understanding that the profile of the learner is that once you come into, the idea is that once you come into ASU, you never really graduate. You know, so at this point in time in your career, you might need this technical degree, but 5 years down the road, you're like, oh, I'm getting into managerial positions. I need to learn a little bit more about leadership or how to manage teams. A few years down the road, it's like, oh, I have this passion for photography, which I never really pursued. I want to do some small photography so that I can sort of spend my time when retirement comes, I can do that more or whatever it may be. It is going to vary by person. And so that's sort of the idea of enterprise, that you can weave in and out of different interests as your sort of learning trajectory, your personal life trajectory evolves. And I think that's a really powerful idea. I think that it is recognizing changes that are happening in society broadly, recognizing that there are lots of people who don't necessarily need degrees, but do need upskilling, you know, either in terms of practical skills or in terms of ways of thinking. Not all skills are, you know, a mechanical or of that nature. So I really exciting sort of a way of about the role of the university. So the Hotel California, anytime you like, but you can never leave. And the point is that you don't need to leave because it's part of the journey that you are going in life as your needs change. I mean, I know for we have done a lot of things without necessarily taking any classes for it. Once I moved from being a faculty member to being an associate dean, it's a different kind of a role. And, you know, I have had to learn things along the way. And maybe there was a nano course 2 hours long, which I can do, which can help me along that way or something like that. So I think that that's a move. And I'm sure ASU is not the only university doing it. But the reason I'm part of some of these conversations and I'm seeing that, and President Crow sort of articulating that over time very clearly, as that these are the three enterprises we're involved in, and the learning enterprise thing that we are jumping into quite strongly now.
So when you're working on that show for ASU, are you going to get us that? Maybe
we could get the person. I mean, we were just talking about that just before. I think they have a new person who's the director of the learning enterprise. We could get somebody from there, and maybe Chris. I wrote about this learning trajectory business for the chapter that we did for that 60-year curriculum book. Some of the other authors there to have that conversation. I mean, I've always Scott, the philosopher, right, that we had, has been interested in having more conversation with him, because he sort of, in that visit, the person who really put on some bulbs in my head was just hearing him, some side conversations that I think that could be a fantastic show to have somebody like him who's looking at the broad historical perspective, and somebody from ASU who's looking at that broader perspective and trying to make it happen, which would be sort of, I think, a nice contrast.
So Young, I haven't answered your question. 4 things, potential shows come to mind as I listen to Chris and I listen to Punya. When I listen to what Chris is saying, I think that maybe, and Punya, both, maybe we need to have a show where a couple people in the corporate setting have taken some micro-credentials or upskilling and reskilling kinds of courses from Udemy or whatever, and how it's impacted their career when they're in the work world. A second one, or maybe a first one before that, undergraduate students and graduate students who are taking these nano degrees and micro-credentials in addition to their graduate courses and getting additional credentials along the way, or maybe getting ready for med school and priming themselves with additional anatomy course or whatever. A third, just something popped in my mind, what would be really a cool show, and I don't know if we can pull it off, would be if we could find another webcast show like ours in another country and have those hosts come in for a show with us and have them talk about the shows that they've been running during the pandemic and compared to the shows that we've been running during the pandemic. It might be interesting to hear a German perspective or an Italian or wherever in the world. And it might be kind of a fun show. Fourth, there are people who have journals for lifelong learning. There's a journal in Canada called Not School. It might be interesting to bring the editor of the journal Not School in to hear how he feels about the reception to the ideas for Not School during the pandemic and afterwards, and how the idea of Not School has evolved, if at all. So those are 4 potential schools. But as I ran around the mountain, as Young calls it, and I get lost because there's no signage, because it's part of my path was under construction. So they didn't say, this is the way back to where you started. Nowhere in it. You just keep going on the loop continually. I decided to take the road eventually and I knew where my car was, and I found the tower, and I got off and took the road back because the paths didn't go back. There was no signage. And I wonder about kids in online learning who are going in these same kind of paths with no teacher to guide them. I'm a firm believer in self-directed learning, but the teacher, there's still a teacher role in all of that. And the teacher role is to help students understand when they've made some accomplishments and to nudge them along further. There was nobody on the path to provide that for me. And I'm sure part of the problem of this past year, a year and a half, has been that teachers weren't provided with courses on scaffolding. They weren't provided with courses on how to adjust how to moderate, how to facilitate, how to nudge, how to engage. So those should be the required classes, especially in these times. And so, I do feel sorry for the learners that we're hearing about that were having problems, but I also feel some joy for the learners that found the online avenue to be more applicable to their learning paths and their goals than traditional school and instruction. So there's a couple of things I've been thinking about as you pose your question, Young.
Well, Kurt, thanks for the suggestions for future episodes. I was just reminded that, there are over 10 million students in China starting tomorrow. They're going to take the college entrance exam. So Punya, yeah, absolutely right. Universities or post-secondary can serve a lot of purposes. But now you got over 10 million students who strive to get some kind of credentials. Yes, universities are changing, the world is changing. And I'm just reminded, I think India, you probably have 10 million students there too, who wants to do this kind of work. So I'm not trying to prescribe anything for them, but I'm imagining if they can't go, how do you redistribute? In the COVID-19 has already scattered students, globally. So where might higher education go is one question, which we will address. I hope when we get episodes to address. But then I'm going to turn to another possibility. Just, we're talking about remote learning. What schools are keeping that? Perhaps we can get a group of superintendents and school leaders to say, why are you keeping this? What's the benefit, and how are you keeping that, despite of the governor's thinking? I'm also particularly interested in, which we can spend the next 20 minutes talk about, is how do you combine both, in person and face and remote, and not out of necessity, but out of desire. We did remote learning out of necessity. We had to do it, but now after a year and a half of experience with this, how do we redo it? How do we combine face to face? Would we let students do 3 days on campus, and then the 2 days they can go learn something else as project-based learning? So I was just wondering, I'm curious about to say, do you guys, any of you, have any proposals for such great integration? Chris, you want to jump on this? Or Kurt? Or Punil?
So we had the program on high flex learning, the episode some time ago. And, Harvard has its Helix system, which is a way of attempting to have a classroom in which some students are face-to-face and others are remote, but they're all kind of co-located in terms of having a presence and feeling an equal amount of interaction and involvement, which is hard to do. So I think that there's a couple ways to think about it. One way to think about it is the sort of hybrid, meaning simultaneous face-to-face and distance. Another way to think about it is hybrid means what you said, Yang, that some of the time you're face-to-face because some things go better face-to-face, and other times you're virtual because some things go better virtually. And so you're mixing and matching in a way that is not just based on how sick people are getting or who's far from campus. It's actually based on instructional design reasons. And I think the latter is one that deserves more attention, that we better understand now than we did a year and a half ago, because the pandemic has forced everybody to do naturalistic experiments about what goes better virtually.
Well, Chris, traditionally in our classroom, we're calling teachers to bring in technology, bring in online resources, which in many ways was kind of funny sometimes, because the teacher has to design that for all the students sitting in the classroom. It's not really kind of distributed in nature to say, well, these students may need this, those students may need that. They're not running that as a large community of different learners. And so now we have a chance to do this. We don't have to force all your 35 students or 25 students to access the same resource, access the same YouTube. Then you can design different tasks, and then some of them may need to come, some don't need to come. It depends on the age, depends on where they are. So that's the kind of redesign and rethinking I don't think many schools are doing, because you need a team of teachers, you need the school leaders to support those kind of work.
So I just dropped a link here. This is a talk given by Crow, and I think this is evolving, an evolving vision. But if you're on that image, the left-hand side, so it talks about sort of these different realms within which learning happens. And so the full, like the campus experience is well in realm one, which is the immersion. But realm 1B, which is the campus digital sync. I mean, these are all buzzwords, but what it means is that the kind of stuff that we came up with for the pandemic is going to continue. So you're going to have a combination. So when my daughter went to ASU, there were classes that she would take that would be fully online. There were some classes which were online and hybrid mixed up, synchronous or asynchronous. There were others which were completely face. And so the idea is that students would go through this experience, and then you have the full digital immersion and so on, right? So I think that, I mean, this is the example I'm giving again, because that's the one I'm clear with. But I think you're going to see many more of this nature starting to emerge. And I think higher ed in some ways is better placed than K-12. K-12 is a political football, right? Where politics statements and impose policies based on what they think the population wants to hear. Well, I think higher ed feels the sort of the economic and the growth pinch, and to maybe innovate a little sooner and faster. So I think those conversations are happening already. And how it would play out, of course, is a different issue.
I was just wondering about in schools. So if we can find a group of schools who are leading the conversation in that direction, because if schools are willing to rethink about, for example, the curriculum, how do we redistribute that through online and face-to-face? Because in the past it was purely remote. Now we're trying to do purely in person. But how do you merge them at a district or school level? I think that's a very different conversation that we need to have. And also, when Kurt was showing those news, some kids benefit more. Would we allow them to do more remote learning, or would we force those students to come to school to say you got to be in person? Then we cut you out, and maybe those students refuse to do that, or maybe there are students who are like Kurt, who were lost, who did not have access and did not learn very well online, but they could be helped. And what kind of help could we produce? Could we do? Would we engage students now they're back in person? We have the opportunities, for example, to help to guide them through online learning. And so how much of that is a personal choice, personal preference, and how much of that is out of learning? That is you were exposed more, you were never exposed. For example, before COVID, we had a lot of families did not want their children to be online at any time. They want their children to be offline. They were not given even the devices. Now suddenly these kids were given access to. How did they learn? How were they learning? I don't think we have a good understanding. I think it's like Chris said right now, the media are really interested in reporting, well, who benefited, those who benefited, those who lost. They were talking about reactions, but not about the process, how they were engaged. Kurt, Chris, you guys want to jump in?
It's always a discussion of what they lost, right?
Yeah.
Students are left behind. They're a grade level behind. Behind what? Who's setting these standards? There's what are they equipping them to do? Even if they're up to grade, they're going to survive and thrive in this highly digital world? I think, Young, when you first asked the question, you had an answer, right? When you said maybe they have 3 days of PBL and 2 days in class. That might be a model. I agree with you. But the thing is, because of COVID, people are more understanding of such a model. People are more receptive of such a model. People might be willing to experiment with such a model. We need to find a couple of those examples and bring them in. Maybe we go back to Brian Beatty and say, you brought in a couple of people at the higher ed level. What about the K-12 level? What have you seen? Maybe it's not high flex, maybe it's something different. But, I think we need to send some feelers out to a couple of people and see what's happening now that is more flexible in terms of learning. That was the key word last week, was flexible, right? But
Kurt, I was wondering if you can track your news stories, you are so well. Could you track some students? I'm really curious to say, what did you do over the last year? That kind of learning. I haven't seen any studies. I don't know if Chris, Pune, or Kurt, you guys have seen any detailed studies that like anthropological studies documenting students' involvement over the last year and a half. What did they actually do? How did they traverse through the process? It's kind of interesting. Maybe we can find an episode that would reflect actually that reality and to say, what did you do?
So I'm wondering whether, it might be interesting to go back to one of our founder members, Scott McLeod, and see if because I know a lot of school leaders, and I think your Twitter feed as well, and to maybe coming back to this question of, can we get some schools who are not willing to go back to exact was, but are seeing sort of this hybrid models evolve and trying them out? It could be really interesting to have a few views. And I'm just wondering if, having Scott put it on his Twitter or his website, and we can
ask Scott. We can tweet out to say if anybody would nominate themselves to talk about that,
or somebody else who they know, some district or somebody. I think that would be a great, which really fits the sort of the silver lining motto, but also, we during the beginning of COVID, and as looking at sort of the aftermath of what are the things that sustain and what don't. And I hear that Chris and Kurt are sort of, concerned about, which is that this push to go back to face-to-face as if it was the be-all and end-all of all education, and we did it perfectly. And I think, and I just want to add one more piece to the point, Chris, that you had said, which is this sort of blaming of the media, design of the media. I mean, if schools normal face-to-face don't work, it's because we haven't designed them right to meet the needs of learners. And it's the same thing for online. It's the same thing for any modality that you choose. It's how it has been designed. And we often attribute things to the thing when it's actually the organization or the structure or the system or the design of the system that is at issue, So I think that'd be interesting.
I'm sending a text to Scott right now. There it goes.
So I'm working on an episode for early August with people who are involved in teacher preparation, who published a book about what teacher educators should have learned from the pandemic. And the question of what teacher education programs are going to do is really interesting. I suspect some programs are going to say, hey, we agree with the governor. There is no role for online education, and therefore, we're going to make sure that no teacher that graduates from our institution is capable of teaching online. Every penny is going to go into face-to-face. Of course, that's a really bad idea. I haven't seen the guarantee that there won't be another pandemic or that there won't be another flare-up of this pandemic. But are teacher education programs actually going to now devote substantial time to how do you teach online so the teachers are prepared for that? Are accreditation organizations actually going to say, we're not going to accredit your program if you're only doing half the job by teaching face-to-face, but not online, when it's clear that that's going to be part of the mix, sometimes because it has to be, but perhaps because it should be. I think that that's a big deal, because otherwise we're going to be, it's going to be deja vu all over again the next time something comes along that forces online.
Well, I just want to point out that Chris, you're right. Teacher education, I don't think many teacher education programs before COVID-19 introduced even students to online teaching. There is an educational technology required course, many schools, but that's really about using technology in your classroom, not on remote learning. So the remote learning we've had is really haphazard. It's that, whatever people make of it, or overnight, over 2 weeks, they made it. Like right now, again, I look at China, just Guangzhou, suddenly we're closing schools. Now, if they close schools today, they have to offer online tomorrow. So this is really, really kind of fabulous, So whatever people experienced over the last year were made that way. Remember, the teachers were isolated. They never had a planning. They never had people tutoring. There was no time to make programs. And luckily there was Zoom. Imagine without Zoom, we were using Skype, we were using other devices, probably would not be night class. It actually was really made up plan. There was no real planning, no real learning about remote learning. And so people survived. And so that is a lesson I think we need to learn. But again, who knows if COVID is going to truly end? We don't know. If it did end, maybe in 3 years, we have another one. May not be COVID. I think people are talking about COVID 24, COVID 36. And so if that happened, what do we do? Not only teacher education, but I think school districts, school leaders, if they made remote learning a part of their school learning, that would be a very different ecosystem. That's why I've been encouraging universities to think about globally distributed students. If you had a bunch of students in Beijing, in let's say UAE, then you some of the teaching has to be face-to-face, but you could hire local services to provide face-to-face elements in that. So I think there will be something drastically changing, if we began to embrace the possibility that's kind of produced by the disruptions of COVID.
Well, employers and workers are both saying, we're not going back to your job is always in the office. So what happens when somebody walks in and says, hey, I'd like you to hire me? And they say, what's your experience with working remotely? And they say, well, sorry, my governor wouldn't let us learn remotely. My mayor said no. So I guess I'm screwed in terms of getting a job now. I mean, really, you can't make this stuff up.
I know.
About how short-sighted people are.
Yeah, that was in the news too. That was in the news yesterday. Okay, but will there be snacks?
So here is my worry. So when I got this email from Zhao more than a year ago saying, what if for a year? And here we are a year later. So now when I hear say COVID 30 or 34, I really begin to worry because he has this ability to predict crap happening around us.
Well, no. I did not invent that. That was, I think, Fauci and a lot of news people were talking about.
I'm kidding. I'm just making fun of that because I think it's just really interesting. Because I remember reading from you. No, and here we are, right? So yeah. So
yeah, but I was.
We bow in your honor, Young.
Oh no! Because this is what I worry. Is school district following their governors, but of course they can undo their governors, So I'm looking. Chris is really getting mad at this. I was really mad.
But young, it's not just COVID. You had H1N1, right? We had swine flu. We had SARS. We had Snowmageddon in DC. We had the earthquake in Haiti. It's not just. So we're going to have something that.
Well, that's why, why isn't there any grant money from the U.S. federal government, for example, to support the redevelopment of the curriculum, not to return to the curriculum?
Wow, if there's something.
Department of Education were smart, they would be saying there's some innovation money, not for you to do technology or to do online, but really for you to rethink where you can go with this.
Right.
Why shouldn't we do that? I don't know. If you
but Zhao,
you got it, Zhao. Yeah.
No, Zhao, I think that's a really good point because when you even think about the sort of the development of the internet and its distributed, it was in large part in response to the Cold War, which is that what if one place gets bombed, you cannot have your communication system shut down, right? And you think about how the distributed nature of the internet is what defines the power of the internet in many ways. And so it's almost like now that we have had this crisis, this is the moment for us to think about how do we build resilient systems that will not fall if there is a snow, whatever, like Kurt you talked about, or it's an earthquake or a hurricane maybe, is like how do we build educational systems which can pivot or have resources to be able to shift modalities and design it the right way.
So I do feel I've been too tough on the politicians that are banning online And so I want to recant a little bit. I'm willing to grant amnesty to any politician who says there's no online learning, and I'm not going to use any kind of online advertising for my campaigns. No social media, no television ads, just face-to-face rallies. I'll get on the bus. I'll go all over the state. The hell with this evil medium of online. If they say that, I'm with them. I'm with them. I won't criticize them anymore. But I require that as a pledge, because otherwise it's just hypocrisy.
Well, you're expecting consistency from a politician, which I hate to rain on that parade.
Well, we're not criticizing any politicians. We're inviting them, and so if you try hard, you might even be able to find some QAnon and supporters come to this show. That's the silver lining of the new learning. That's possible. Just so this is one final question. I want to raise to you guys. We also talk about UDL, Universal Design for Learning. It's becoming popular. It's become important in all those things. And some of you are into design. And so my really big question is that who designs the system? So Universal Design for Learning, you design the ecosystem. Punya, you and I, we're still trying to write a book. Okay, Punya, we'll talk about what's the role of the students? When you do universal design, do you also design for the individual students, or can the students design for themselves? Just your reaction, just comments about that. Wow, that's a tough question. All right, I'm going to raise the question again to say that I'm not against universal design, by the way, but I have always wondered about that. When you give too much authority to designers and whatever principle they follow, they can't possibly design for every student.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I brought it up during that conversation, or maybe I didn't exactly. I mean, that's my concerns with UDL, that sometimes it comes out looking more like a manifesto. This is the only and the right way to do it, which to me undermines the whole basis of why UDL or design, which is accepting of a variety of users, practitioners, or whatever, or learners. And so unless the part of it, I don't see how it can be UDL. You're truly UDL, right? So yeah, I mean, I get that tension, and I don't know whether that got addressed in the episodes or not.
Well, it's an acronym problem fundamentally, because the universal is in the wrong place. If it was designed for universal learning, it would make sense, but then the acronym would be dull. So, what can you do?
So yes,
I have to say one thing though.
You're supporting the argument, right?
Supporting the argument. I think it's designed for universal learning. Universal design implies a kind of, magic formula.
That's a really good point, Chris. So one of the things, I sort of snuck in that I made for that was I had this 2 of the street in Berkeley where they fought really hard things called curb cuts. This little slopes that you have on the curbs, because this one particular student couldn't attend classes. So this actually became a social movement where they would go in at night and concrete, or they would break these. And what's amazing about that is that now it has been codified into law. Makes it easy for your delivery person, makes it easy for the parent who a stroller. And so to me, the power of UDL really, or the behind DUL or UDL, whatever you want to call it, is the form that we create for one group end up influencing or providing avenues for groups that we had not participated in the past. So that's a piece from really, I think, which is that you are designing, not that you're creating avenues and opportunities for a wide range of users that you may not even anticipate when you started, design, and I think that to me, the same thing with like closed captioning on TV. I use it all the time. Many of the movies I watch, they mumble the dialogues, right? I was not designed for me or created for me, but it's a great asset and I use it all the time. So it's things that I think that as we think, and particularly with digital technologies, that is so much better to do for not that much cost, that I think that's a really powerful thing.
But remember, Punya, I just want to add that when they cut the corners, when they design closed captioning, all the uses happened later. When they designed it, they did not say, okay, we'll design this for this and for that. So that's why, with this UDL part is, you got to think of when they're design, you happen to have picked up by others. So that doesn't mean the design from UDL, so.
Right,
okay.
No, I agree. So, so that point that, the great example is, the people who made the OXO peeler. So when they wanted to make the peeler design for the people in the middle of their idea was, can we design a peeler which an arthritic grandmother could use as a football player? And so when you're thinking of the profile of learners, you actually want to be the extremes, not for the middle. While most of the time what we're doing is we design for the middle. If you start with the extremes and you design for them, you'll find that you'll actually end up creating solutions we be able to predict. That's the beauty of it. It'll get picked up by different groups. So text to speech is another great example. If you keep it to students who are special need or dyslexic or whatever, turns out there are a lot more students who we haven't labeled who like that, and that's perfectly fine. And I think that's, to me, one of the important things here to think about is that. So yeah, anyway, that's the broader point, I think, and I agree with you. It's not that they predicted others would use it, and it so happened that they picked it up.
So that UDL
provides
a bridge,
Kurt,
provides a chance to talk about, for teachers to talk about making their instruction available for multiple types of learners. It goes back to this article, a pandemic silver lining, getting faculty to talk about their teaching. That's the silver lining, to talk. And maybe we can improve our teaching. Scott McLeod has replied. He says, maybe when,
right.
Thanks for thinking of me. So
we always think about it. So unless you have any final wise words, I want to give Punya really 3 minutes to talk about next 3 episodes. And Punya and I will co-constructed this. And I think Punya, go for it. And this may take a little bit of while to explain why and how.
Sure. So Zhao and I were talking, this is a few months back, and we were sort of really interested in trying to get a series of 3 episodes which focus around the broad issue of creativity, play, and self-directed learning. So this next 3 episodes that are coming up, and again, we don't need to make the case for why creativity is important. I think just the fact that, as Zhao said, we have to be prepared for COVID-30 or whatever he says, that developing creativity becomes this really important aspect of what education can and should be. So episode 62, which is next week, it's a new time. It's at 11:30 Eastern. We will have Vlad and Edward Clapp. So Chris, you might know Edward from his work in Project Zero and participatory creativity. The emphasis here in this work around participatory creativity. Vlad Glavinov is a professor and Department of Psychology at Webster University in Geneva. Really interesting person, has written a book on wonder, has developed this framework for, creativity very often has been talked about, the lone solo genius terms. He has a much broader sociocultural sort of a framework around creativity. So he sort of gives more of the theory side of things. He is a PI on Project Zero, interested in creativity and innovation and design, maker-centered learning. And they had a chapter together. So I thought they would make a really good pair where, Vlad speaks more around the theory of stuff, though he has, and he has done some really work around collaborative and social movements and so on. And talking more around the sort of the work that he's done with an educator. So that's next week. The week after that, that is, I think, would be episode 63. So Zhao, if it's just Pasi Solberg or Pasi with someone else, I think that you
Pass it with someone else. I just communicated with him. Yeah, he's
Okay.
going to talk about his book about play.
Yeah, so he has a book called Let Children Play. Again, Posse is well-renowned, international name space around educational reform. And, I think the conversation go with him in many different directions, though play would be one piece of it. And the episode after that, that's on June 19th. The episode on 26th is with Peter Gray. Peter Gray is an evolutionary psychologist. He's known for his work around education and play, bringing an evolutionary lens to that. Paired with him is Bria Bloom. Bria Bloom is executive director for Alliance for Self-Directed Education. The whole unschooling, this is coming back to a point that you made earlier. So I was going to there that we are having somebody along those lines as well. And again, in at least the episode and the 1-2 weeks from now, it's a pairing of comic with a practitioner. So I thought that would be a good mix. So we're going to have these 3 shows focusing on creative and self-directed learning, which I think is going to be pretty exciting.
All right. Thank you guys for joining. We'll see you next week.
Thank you all. Be good.